for cow-calf operations, external parasite control, and then we will wrap up with the cattle market update. So let's get started. So first and foremost, we always want to reiterate that the label is the law. Always read the pesticide label before using and follow all label directions. So that label contains important information such as precautions, the use rate, mixing rate, which weeds it controls, and much more than that. So if you ever have a product that doesn't have a label on it for whatever reason, it's gotten torn off or anything like that, you can go to cdms.net for a library of labels. Okay, the first weed or plant we're going to talk about this morning is Texas bullnettle. So you can see the first few pictures here. We've got the whole plant, close-up of the flower, and a close-up of all those tiny little stinging hairs that we're probably all familiar with. So next, Texas bullnettle is actually in the spurge family. It is native to Texas. It is a spiny, deep-rooted, herbaceous, warm season perennial. It can grow up to 3 feet tall. Its habitat is all soil types across Texas, and it's most commonly found in the sandy soils of East Texas, but it seems to be everywhere except for far west and deep East Texas, according to the Weed Busters publication. So you may know some people in deep East Texas that have some there, though. I just thought that was interesting. It is a single root system. The stems produce a milky white sap when broken. It flowers April through September. And then those flowers consist of 5 to 7 white, showy, petal-like sepals, which are basically petals, and they are all connected from underneath. It produces a seed within a fruit with a tough outer shell. Texas bullnettle is also a very aggressive competitor in improved pastures, rangelands, and disturbed areas. Something interesting I just found out in my research is that it's also known as maha mujer, I assume is how you pronounce that. I'd never heard that before. Okay, the dangers of Texas bullnettle. Well, like I said, some of y'all are probably familiar with this. The leaves are covered with stiff, stinging hairs or spines. There are 1 to several spiny stems from the single root system. It is also very deep-rooted, so that's part of the reason why it's considered an aggressive invader in pastures and rangelands. So that's why I label it under a danger of it. The seeds are within a 3-compartment seed pod or fruit with a tough outer shell. So that tough outer shell is also why I listed as a danger, because those seeds are very well protected. Lastly, it is a very poor forage value for livestock and wildlife. So control, probably what you're all interested in the most. We recommend a post-emergent control with a product containing 2,4-D and either one of the 3, picloram, dicamba, or aminopyrrolid. So some examples of those products are Grazon P plus D and Gunslinger, which both contain 2,4-D and picloram. Weedmaster and Range Star both contain 2,4-D and dicamba. And then your Grazon Next contains 2,4-D and aminopyrrolid. So products containing metsulfuron methyl, MSM, are a good alternative if you don't have a pesticide license, but all of you here today probably should have that. MSM is typically not recommended for use on bahia grass, just in general, so you can keep that in mind. We also recommend a broadcast application in the spring when the plant begins to flower. So right now is going to be your best time to control this bullnettle. We recommend a rate of 10 to 30 gallons per acre. And the chart on the next page here is going to give us a little more detail. So let's go on over to that. Okay, so I see here it's a little blurry. I apologize for that. Control, so that Graze on P plus D and Gunslinger, you're going to want to apply at 1 to 1.5 quarts per acre. Weedmaster and Range Star, 1 quart per acre. And you notice that we do recommend a surfactant with that. So you want to mix that surfactant in 1 to 2 quarts per 100 gallons of water, excuse me. And so all of that together is going to make a spray volume of about 10 to 30 gallons per acre. So why that surfactant? That is to help the herbicide stick to the plant so that it can be more efficiently absorbed. Okay, just a couple more facts about Texas bullnettle. It has a couple plants that look or sound familiar to it. So Carolina horse nettle is, or I'm sorry, small or stinging nettle is on the top right. Carolina horse nettle is on the bottom left, and Silverleaf Nightshade on the bottom right. All of those also contain those spiny leaves and hairs on the stems. Actually, only stinging nettle is in the nettle family. So I thought that was pretty interesting that bullnettle's not even in that family. Stinging nettle has one distinguishable attribute, its physical appearance. It's overall a much smaller plant than bullnettle and has a different leaf structure. So shouldn't be hard to tell those apart, but you want to avoid them just the same because they sting. Carolina horse nettle, it's actually in the nightshade family. And then, of course, Silverleaf Nightshade, also in that family, which we're going to learn about a little bit later. So don't want to take away too much from that. But probably what Texas bullnettle looks the most like is that Carolina horse nettle. But you can see from this picture, the blooms are a little bit different. That Carolina horse nettle has a yellow center. Okay, moving on to our next weed of interest is going to be bitter sneezeweed. So a few pictures here indicate, well, we've got a close-up of the entire plant, the leaf structure, close-up of the flowers, and then that picture on the bottom right that you're probably all familiar with as you're driving down the road. There's probably a few pastures that are going to look like that soon. Okay, so bitter sneezeweed is in the sunflower family. It's a native warm season annual, and excuse me, it's commonly found in disturbed sandy or loamy soils. It's common to the eastern and central part of the state. And the reddish brown variety that's in this picture is typically found in calcareous soils in the central and western part of the state. So it has yellow, showy flowers that are noticeable in late spring to summer. And there are actually two varieties, one with the solid yellow center and then this one with the reddish brown center. Each bloom has about 8 petals with 3 lobes. And I thought it was interesting that these petals typically bend down with maturity, and that's kind of what's going on in some of those flowers in this picture. The leaves are narrow and located alternately on the stem. This plant can grow up to 10 to 20 inches in height. Now, bitter sneezeweed also has a toxic agent that we need to familiarize with. It's seldom consumed at a level high enough to cause a toxicity because this plant is so unpalatable. But it's called the sesquiterpene lactone agent. And if consumed, it will cause bitter tasting meat and milk from those animals. But the plant contains a strong odor and a bitter taste, so that's what makes it unpalatable. Also, this toxin is stable in plants, meaning that if you cut hay, that hay if you cut hay off a pasture that has this weed, that hay is still going to be contaminated after it's cut. So cutting it isn't going to kill that or remove that toxin in any way. Just a few symptoms to go over real quick. Weakness, loss of coordination, vomiting, salivation, diarrhea, and grinding of teeth. But again, it's not very common because it's usually not consumed at a level high enough to create that toxicity. All right, control for bitter sneezeweed. We recommend a post-emergent control with a product containing 2,4-D. Pretty much all of these products in this list do contain 2,4-D, either by itself or with another chemical. From this chart, which is from a quick guide to weed management in pastures and forages from AgriLife, indicates that it indicates alternative herbicides and their application rates. Excuse me. So like 2,4-D, we're going to go 1 to 2 pints per acre. Graze on P plus D, we're going to go 1 to 2 pints per acre. Your graze on next down there at the bottom is similar, 1.5 to 2 pints per acre. So again, there's just that important rule of reading the label on any one of these products that you use and confirming that this recommended label is what it says. So also you can see at the bottom of this chart that mechanical control is also an option for many broadleaf pasture that's the important factor, annual broadleaf pasture weeds. But you have to do it early enough to allow for maximum forage response, meaning you want to cut the weeds down before they go to seed, which will then allow that forage to mature and take over. Oh, excuse me. We're not done with that yet. Okay, moving on. All right, so an interesting fact, well, not a fact, but just something that I think is interesting to me, Texas groundsel, which is a cool season annual, it actually looks a little bit like bitter sneezeweed, really only in the flowers though. So they shouldn't overlap in the growing season since Texas groundsel is a cool season annual and bitter sneezeweed is a warm season annual. But just for your information here, a little bit of the picture and a reminder about that leaf structure and how they do actually look different. But you've got to look at the whole plant, not just those flowers, okay? Okay, moving on to our last weed in my section, we are going to talk about Blackberry and Dewberry, both wild varieties. And we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth, but on the left, I believe we have wild Blackberry, and then on the right, you can see, well, we'll talk about how you can determine this, but on the right, we've got wild Dewberry. Of course, they're also at different stages of development. Okay, so wild Blackberry and wild Dewberry, they're both in the Rosacea family. They are native warm season perennials, and actually there are 10 species of Blackberry in Texas. Blackberry, which is known as Rubus oklahomus, is an upright, thicket-forming shrub with prickly stems. It can grow 4 to 6 feet tall, and its stems have fewer hairs and contain broad-based thorns, so a little bit thicker thorns. Both reproduce from seed, roots, and daughter plants when the ends of the stem reach the soil. The leaves are located alternately along the stems, and each have 5 leaflets arranged in a star-like shape. Each leaflet has small teeth around the edges. Blackberry leaflets are hairy underneath, while dewberry leaves are hairless. Both have flowers that are 1/2 to 1 inch in diameter, with 5 petals and 5 green sepals. They bloom in late spring to early summer. The fruit, which is a berry, is ripe when black and about 1/3 to 1 inch in diameter. Dewberry typically blooms about 1 to 2 months earlier in the spring than blackberry, but those blooms do look very similar, and then the fruit looks very similar. All varieties prefer moist soil and grow in wooded areas of East Texas and Central Texas. Now, blackberry tends to grow in impenetrable thickets and causes access problems. So it gets a lot taller, a lot thicker. While your dewberry is commonly found along fence rows, roadsides, and in lower scattered thickets. Wildlife, both of these are used by wildlife, but has little value for livestock. So in this picture on your screen, I believe that to be blackberry. You can see there are no little or very little red hairs. Those thorns, which it's pretty hard to see, but to me they look broad, a little wider and thicker. Now, dewberry, again, lots of similarities, same family, reproduced from seeds, roots, and daughter plants, same white flowers. They both prefer generally the same type of soil. But your dewberry is known as Rubus trivialis. And again, it has that low vine-like trailing growth habit that forms mats that are rarely greater than 2 feet tall. Your dewberry has slender thorns and numerous red hairs known as glandular tipped bristles. So you can see this is a real good close-up picture of all those little red hairs along with the thorns. Excuse me. So control for blackberry. Can we mow or cut it? Well, alone, mowing and cutting will not control any of the species. It may temporarily reduce the size or the top growth, but they will rapidly recover. Also, I should have said first, control for all species of blackberry and dewberry is pretty much the same. So mowing or cutting, not really the best option. So we recommend a herbicide control option, either Chaparral or Cimarron Plus, which again, those contain metsulfuron methyl, MSM, and aren't really recommended for vaseygrass. So another option would be Remedy Ultra, Pasture Guard HL, or Surmount. Now, all of those contain either triclopyr and fluroxypyr, or picloram and fluroxypyr. So the application is going to be most effective when blooming, so in late spring when they're blooming, or in the fall prior to the first frost. And also pretty much with any plant, we don't recommend that you spray any drought-stressed plants. But the key in controlling blackberry and dewberry is going to be persistence. So it's not going to be a one and done. You're going to have to really stay on top of it. And one more thing, just to kind of reiterate, again, it's hard to see in these pictures, but on the left, that should be a blackberry fruit. You can see on the stem behind it, there's not very many red hairs. And then the picture on the right, we've got a dewberry fruit, and you can see in that stem towards the bottom that all of those little red hairs, okay? But again, control is pretty much the same, so it's not necessarily important to determine them apart, and unless that's just something you're interested in. Now, can we eat the plant? Is it edible? Some people do. I actually know a family that has a wild dewberry picking party every year. But this decision should be left up to you. You should use your own discretion. And agents typically don't give recommendations on whether a plant is safe to eat or not. So that's something up to you. And I'm sure there's lots of recipes out there if you're interested in that. And you can go out and look for those. All right, I believe that wraps up my segment, and I'm going to turn it over to Callie now. Callie, if you will let me know when it's time to change the slides, I will do that for you. And I'm going to
Okay.
mute myself.
Can you guys hear me okay on the computer?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can? Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. All right, I'm going to hang up. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Casey. Okay, so the first weed that I'm going to talk about is going to be sand burr or grass burr. And these are just a few pictures at different growth stages to give you an idea of what it looks like. And it's referred to as both grass burr or sand burr. And if I gave you the picture on the bottom left-hand side, you would probably all be able to identify it. But if we just provided the picture over there on the right-hand side of the screen, that would probably get a little bit more challenging to identify, especially when you think about this grassy weed in a grass crop. It gets extremely hard to pick out in your hay fields among Bermuda grass and Bahia grass and those grasses that we utilize as forages. So when you think about it, it's a lot easier to probably pick out a broadleaf weed that has a bright, showy yellow flower or purple flower among our grasses. So that's what makes this plant a little bit hard to identify and to control. So, but that's also a really good reason why plant identification is so important, because if you can't identify it, you can't properly manage it. So this picture over here on the right is a mature grass burr, which is probably easily identifiable to everyone. And like most plants, they are generally easier to pick out when they have a seed head. So if you're seeing this in your fields, it's too late to treat at that point. But if you look at the top left, or yes, the top left picture, that is a sand burr seedling, and that is the proper time to treat for sand burr or grass burr. And if you look really closely at that picture, you'll notice that there is a burr attached to that root system where it's emerged from the soil. And so that is the right time to treat. And then in the bottom left, there's a really good illustration on the seeds. So that burr that sticks in our shoelaces and in livestock hair and wool is actually acting as a capsule that contains anywhere from 1 to 3 seeds. And so that is its kind of survival tactic, is to attach to the hair of livestock, the wool, equipment, shoelaces. That's the way that it tries to reproduce and spread. So you can go to the next slide, Casey. Okay, so grass burr, like we talked about, like most plants, it's really easy to pick out in that mature stage when we can see that seed head and when we can see those burrs. Like we talked about, the burrs, the capsule that contains anywhere from 1 to 3 seeds. Is it an annual or perennial plant? Typically, we think of sand burr or grass burr as an annual, but it can actually be both. And so sometimes it can survive the winters and come back from the root system, which makes it very challenging to control as compared to whether it's an annual coming back from seed. So it also is a warm season plant right along with our Bahia grass and Bermuda grass that we use as forages. And then it can often be a really good indicator of a weak forage stand or low soil fertility. So it's always best to manage your crops so that they're healthy and that they can outcompete weed species. So it's always good to do soil samples and monitor that soil fertility, especially if you're harvesting hay and forage off of that property. So it is a fair grazing value to livestock. They will consume it when it's young, but most people do not want burrs in their hay, especially if they're selling it to people. So early identification is really critical to effectively control this weed. And a really good identification tip is that it has a somewhat flattened and purplish colored base. And so that is something that can kind of help differentiate between your Bermuda grass and Bahia grasses if you're out in a hayfield. So it's really important to make sure that you're scouting fields this time of year. If identifying plants is maybe a little bit challenging, you can also monitor your soil temperature to kind of gauge when certain plants and weeds are going to be germinating to give you a timeline to follow. Some different control options, they're broken down into two major categories here. We have pre-emergent herbicides, and then we have post-emergent herbicides that will work for grass burr. And so our first option is going to be glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in the product Roundup. And so you can apply this product at anywhere from 8 to 11 ounces per acre after your first hay cutting. It's important to do this as soon as possible after that first hay cutting so that Bermuda grass foliage doesn't take up any of the glyphosate product. Pastora is another post-emergent herbicide that will work on sandburr. And like Casey stated earlier, the active ingredient in that is metsulfuron methyl. And so that's really important to know because that will control Bahia grass. And so if you have a little bit of Bahia mixed in with your Bermuda grass fields, you'll probably want to avoid using that product. And you will apply this product when sandburr's newly germinated anywhere to 1.5 inches tall. Something else to keep in mind is when you're making this application, you'll want to make sure that the Bermuda grass is less than 4 inches tall following the green up so that the Bermuda grass doesn't intercept any of that product and reduce your control there. The next product is a pre-emergent that you can use that's labeled for winter dormant Bermuda grass, Prowl H2O, and you can apply that broadcast at a rate of 1.1 to 4.2 quarts per acre. So something to keep in mind on this particular product is that you have to apply it prior to rainfall, and so timing on this product is really critical, and it can be a little bit challenging because we all know how difficult it can be to keep up with the weather and rainfall patterns sometimes. So you can go to the next slide, Casey. Okay, this next plant is vaseygrass. It's a really common problem in the southeast in some of their pastures and hayfields, and we do have it here in northeast Texas. It's characterized often by its really tall seed heads, and some people might say that it resembles Johnsongrass. So you can go to the next slide, Casey. So this plant was introduced from South America, and it can really become invasive and weedy, especially in areas that are wet and poorly drained. They're often found in low-lying areas where water collects in fields and along streams and creeks and things like that. It also is a perennial warm season plant, and it is a bunch grass. So you can go to the next slide, Casey. So we're a little bit limited on control options for vaseygrass. The first option would be glyphosate, and you can spot treat with a 1% solution at 1.2 ounces per gallon. Pastora is another option, but again, that will damage Bahia grass. So you can apply that at 1 to 1.5 ounces per acre when it is 10 inches to 14 inches in height or diameter. And this particular product also calls for a non-ionic surfactant at 1 quart per 100 gallons of spray solution. Again, this is only for Bermuda grass. So this next weed that I'll talk about is milkweed, and there are many, many different species of milkweeds. And so you kind of notice in these pictures, there's a pretty wide variety of appearances. And then I also included a certain insect that utilizes milkweed. But there's over 30 different species of milkweeds listed in Texas alone. And so that previous picture, the top right, was antelope horn milkweed, which is a weed that you've probably seen growing here in Northeast Texas and scattered across the state. So you can go to the next slide, Casey. I'm sure everyone's probably aware or have done this. When you damage a milkweed plant or pull a leaf off, they emit a very milky sap when they're damaged. And so that's very characteristic of milkweeds and how it gets the name. As with most weed species, it increases when you increase grazing pressure. So that's something to keep in mind, is to properly manage your stalking rates. It can also be toxic to livestock if they consume this plant. And so my final point down here is this plant may be a weed to some people, probably most beef and forage producers, but it's a very desirable plant for some people who really enjoy butterflies, especially the monarch butterfly. And so this weed probably gets more media attention than many weeds out there, because it is so beneficial to some of our pollinators like the monarch butterfly. The caterpillars feed on the leaves of the milkweed. And so we have to keep in mind the definition of a weed is a plant out of place. And so if you enjoy butterflies, then it might not be a weed to you, and you might not consider controlling it in your pastures or hayfields, but it could definitely be a weed to some people, especially if you're growing hay crops. So some different control options here. Cimarron Max effectively controls milkweed, and that is a 2-part herbicide. So you'll apply 0.25 ounces per acre of Part A, which is the metsulfuron methyl, and then 1 pint per acre of Part B. Surmount is also effective at treating milkweed, and you'll apply that at 2 to 3 pints per acre and in the vegetative stage before it blooms. Grazon P plus D is another option at 4 pints per acre to actively growing weeds and to weeds less than 4 inches tall. In this particular product, it does call for a surfactant to help the wetting of the foliage to get better coverage. And then the final product down here is Tordon 22K, and you again treat that during active growth, and you tank mix 1 pound per acre of 2,4-D and a surfactant. And so Casey had showed the slide of the herbicide labels and the importance of reading the labels. All of this information was pulled directly off of those herbicide labels. And so that's why it's really important to make sure that you thoroughly read that information before mixing and before applying, because all of these products, they do control milkweed, but they call for different rates. Some of them call for surfactants, and some of them require different mixing directions. So that's something to definitely keep in mind, and note that the label is the law and to always follow those directions. So next slide, Casey. Okay, so Sarah Broad is going to talk about the next 3 weeds, and I'll turn it over to you, Sarah.
All right, thank you. All right, Casey. Thank you. All right, so I'm sure a lot of people recognize this. This is Silverleaf Nightshade. It kind of gives you a close-up of the flower and then the actual plant itself. You can see the little tiny stickers on it on the plant. And then it also shows you the fruit there in that bottom left-hand corner. It's pretty easy to recognize. The leaves kind of have a silver look to them. All right, Casey. The leaves on Silverleaf Nightshade are lance-shaped to narrowly oblong and wavy in the margins. The flowers are, they're pretty showy, and typically they're going to be normally violet or bluish. Sometimes they're going to be white, but you're mostly going to see that violet or bluish color. And then it's got a round yellow fruit that can be up to ½ inch in diameter that's going to appear between May to October. And it's actually a member of the potato family. All right, Casey, thank you. And so it is a broadleaf perennial. As I said, it's a member of the potato family. It's going to reproduce by seed as well as creeping rootstock. And it is toxic to livestock. It can actually be poisonous if they consume as little of 0.1 to 0.3% of their body weight. So it doesn't take a whole lot to be toxic to your livestock. Okay. Silverleaf Nightshade should be sprayed in the spring once those plants have begun to flower. And actually, I've got some coming up right now that I've been watching, and they're getting close. So you want to spray those once they begin to flower, which is kind of different. A lot of times we need to get to plants before they flower, but this one we need to get to as it begins to flower. And then some of your herbicide options are Grazon P+D at a rate of 1 to 1.5 quarts per acre with a spray volume of 10 to 30 gallons per acre. And on all of these, you're going to want to have a surfactant of 1 to 2 quarts per 100 gallons of water. You can also use Weedmaster at 1 quart to the acre, or Range Star also at 1 quart per acre. You're going to apply this as a coarse spray. And then something that I learned is that it's controlling the Silverleaf Nightshade. It's not a one-time job. You're not going to be able to just spray it and then be done. You're going to need to retreat periodically, and it could take you, 2 or 3 years to get really good control of this Silverleaf Nightshade. All right, Casey. Thanks. All right, this next weed, I think most everybody will recognize. This is woolly croton or goatweed. And so if you look, we've got some different stages there. You've got kind of the whole plant that you can see with some of the flowers on it, and then a close-up of those flowers and seeds. And then down in that bottom corner, you've got a small goatweed coming up, which I was looking the other day in my pasture, and we've got a few coming up right now. So it's coming on. All right. So woolly croton has star-shaped hairs on the surfaces of the leaves and the stems, and that kind of gives it its name, the woolly croton. Leaves are attached to the stem by a stalk called a petiole. The leaves have no lobes and are usually entire and located alternately along the stem. And then they're going to produce a real aromatic smell when they're crushed. So if you take one and crush it, you'll know for sure. The flowers are arranged in spikes at the ends of the stem. And the fruit is in a capsule that has 3 segments supporting 3 individual seeds. It is a native warm season annual, and it reproduces via seeds. And so you want to try to get to this plant before it starts producing those seeds. It produces a lot. And they're typically associated with soil disturbance, lack of soil cover, or overgrazing, as a lot of our weeds are. Okay. It's pretty easy to control. Herbicide should be applied in May or early June when plants are less than 12 inches tall. And you can use any product that's got 2,4-D amine at 1 to 2 pints per acre. Or you can also use metsulfuron 60DF, Grazon P+D, Grazon Next HL, or and dicamba plus 2,4-D are all products that would help control or would control woolly croton. Now, one thing about woolly croton is that it is, as Callie was talking earlier about, when's a weed, and it just depends on, if you need it or not. And these plants are actually good for dove. Dove particularly like these types of plants. So you may need it if you're dove hunting, but probably not in your hay pasture. All right, Casey. All right, and the last weed that we're going to talk about is Amaranthus, or careless weed. It's also known as pigweed. It's pretty common. It's one of my least favorite ones to see. I hate to walk through it. And so you've got three pretty good sized, a good sized plant there. They do get very big. So you've got a big plant there, and then in the middle, kind of when it's getting a little bigger, and then when it's first started over on the right hand side. As I said, it's also known as careless weed or pigweed. Then their inflorescences consist of densely packed flowers and terminal or axillary spikes or panicles. There are 23 species of Amaranthus found in Texas. They vary in growth forms from being prostrate to branching upright. So you'll see you can see several different types. And it's fun note, it's called pigweed because swine actually really like it. So, but one thing to remember is that it does accumulate nitrates from the soil, and so they can accumulate it up to toxic levels and be possibly toxic to your livestock if they happen to try to eat that. Hopefully they're not. All right, Casey. It is a summer annual. It's a broadleaf. They're very prolific seed producers. Single plants can produce thousands and thousands of seeds. And so it's important to get them controlled before they produce seeds. They abound on disturbed sites. So especially in barnyards or places with rich, moist soils, I see it a lot where I've had like round bales of hay that didn't get cleaned up very well or something like that. And it's also a very common weed in croplands. All right, Casey. You want to spray these when they're less than 12 inches tall to get good control. And given adequate rainfall, pigweed seeds are going to germinate throughout the summer. So if you happen to have some that went to seed, you may get them all controlled with a herbicide treatment, and then you look up here in just a little bit and you've got a whole nother flush of seedlings. So you're probably going to have to do repeat applications to get a full season control. And you can use Cimarron Plus, Metsulfuron 60DF, Grazon P plus D, Grazon Next HL, and Dicamba plus 2,4-D and 2,4-D amine. They're all going to provide good control on seedling pigweed, but you definitely want to get to those before they're 12 inches tall. So, thank you.
This is Casey here. There we go. Okay, I thought we were frozen up for a second. But I just wanted to mention that Sarah said that the Silverleaf Nightshade is in the potato family. And if that confuses anybody, since I said Carolina horse nettle and Silverleaf Nightshade are in the nightshade family, those are one and the same. The scientific name is actually Solanaceae. So they're all potato, nightshade, they're all in the same family. So thought that was interesting. Brian, going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Casey. If you'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to discuss 3 more plants, and then we'll be finished up with our discussion of the 12 weeds to control or to be on the lookout for in your pastures and hay meadows. And the first one I'm going to start off with is probably one that you've seen, if not in your own pasture, probably growing in a field or a ditch. This one is Johnsongrass. And Johnsongrass should be noticeable from the broad white midrib that is in the middle of the image on the upper left part of the slide there. You see the wide leaf blade that's got a white rib running down the middle of it. Early in the season, it'll be short growing like you see on the bottom left. Sometimes it'll be purplish if it's under stress, maybe for temperature or moisture. And then on the right, you'll see kind of a mature plant. You'll see that very typical cone or kind of triangular shaped panicle or flower at the top of the plant there that'll be kind of yellow, maybe the purplish in color. Like a lot of the grasses that we have here in the United States today, Johnsongrass is not native to the United States. It was brought in the 1800s from Turkey as a forage and grass and for erosion control. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Johnsongrass is in that same family with corn and some of the other grains. It's a perennial, and so once it gets established, it can grow from seed that it produces, or these scaly underground rhizomes, which are basically underground stems that you can see in the picture in the bottom right there, that the plant sends out these underground stems, and then little daughter plants start to pop up. You know, it can get up to 3 to 6 feet tall depending on moisture. It's usually a lot shorter during dry periods, and typically it decreases with grazing in a field. Now, it is something that cattle like to eat. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So it's kind of a double-edged sword if you have Johnsongrass out there. I know producers that roll Johnsongrass up into haylage and often put it into hay. But sometimes we can have some issues there, some toxicity issues. So it can produce under certain conditions of drought or frost stress some cyanogenic glycosides, which you might hear called prussic acid. It is one of the most rapidly acting toxins that's out there, or toxic substances that's out there. Cattle can be affected by it within as quickly as about 5 minutes of consuming it. These cyanogenic compounds, or the prussic acid, is mainly concentrated in the new growth and the new leaves of the plant. You get a light frost that can cause this to build up in the plant, or if we get some some drought conditions, that can cause some issues with this plant as well. So if you go into the fall and you get a frost, it's best to let the plants recover and start to freshen up and grow again from the frost. Or if we get a hard frost, it's best to let the plants go ahead and dry down and turn brown before you turn livestock back out in there for them to graze. It will volatilize from the plant if you cut it for hay. It will go out of the hay over time. If you're worried about prussic acid, our Texas Vet Medical Diagnostic Lab, our TVMDL, can do some testing for prussic acid. The other compound that can accumulate in this plant is called nitrates. And nitrate is nitrogen that the plant has taken in from the soil, but it's not able to utilize due to low moisture conditions. It's usually accumulated in the lower half to a third of the plant, primarily in the stalks and the leaves. Nitrate, unlike the prussic acid, is stable in the forage. So if it's in there and you cut it for hay, it will stay in the hay. If you have fertilized the stand of Johnsongrass heavily and then it doesn't rain, you may need to be concerned about that. Our soils lab in College Station can test for nitrates and let you know what the amounts are. And if they're too high, you may not be able to use it as a forage. If it's in a certain range, you may be able to blend it with some other hay and still feed it. Typically, you need to wait about a week or so after a good rain for the grass to be able to mobilize and move that nitrate out and utilize it in order for the nitrate levels to go down if they've gotten high. Go ahead, Casey. Control products. Johnsongrass can be controlled with several different products out there. Outrider, which is sulfosulfuron, an ounce and a third per acre, plus 0.25% non-ionic surfactant, can be a control product when the Johnsongrass is about 1.5 feet to 2 foot tall. It's recommended with this product that you not mow or graze for 2 weeks before or after treatment. So that means no mowing, no grazing for about a month in there. And it also can take about a month for the Johnsongrass to start to turn brown after treatment with Outrider. So it's a product that takes quite a while to work. Panoramic, which is imazapic at 4 ounces per acre, can be used as well. It will stunt your Bermuda grass, and if you are going to go that route, you can expect, like with the outrider above, you can kind of expect a loss of a hay cutting or not being able to really utilize that field much. Pastora at 1 ounce per acre when the Johnsongrass is 10 to 18 inches tall, or mow it and let it get up about 6 to 8 inches before you spray. Pastora is nicosulfuron plus metsulfuron methyl, or glyphosate as spot treatments. Go ahead, Casey. Our next plant, also a grass, is one that you probably see growing in a hayfield as well, or out in a pasture, and that's Dallisgrass. Now, Dallisgrass is also an introduced forage. It was brought into the United States from Brazil and Argentina as a forage grass. It's a perennial, and it's either erect growing or kind of spreading. It can sometimes be confused for bahia grass, but when you see the branches on the flower up in the upper right of the slide, bahia grass is primarily going to have 2 branches to the flower, possibly 3, whereas Dallisgrass is going to have usually 3 to 5, maybe more. And then if you look at the seeds are going to be 4 across in a row. And also, if you look to where the bottom right picture in this slide, if you look to where the leaf attaches to the stem, you will see a ligule there, which is a little membrane, kind of a clearish white membrane, and you'll see some hairs there. Also noticeable on one side of the leaf of the Dallisgrass where it attaches to the stem, you'll notice, like in this picture here, it's kind of crinkly like fried bacon. And that's another, that wrinkly look there is also something that you can look for. Go ahead, Casey. So again, it's a warm season perennial. You've got that membrane and the hairs. And the seeds are fuzzy, kind of like tomato seeds. And if you look at the picture here at the bottom right, you'll also notice that where the axis, where the flower branches there attaches to the stem, you'll notice some hairs there as well. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Dallisgrass is good grazing for livestock. It likes moist areas, bottomland pastures, but in the summer, when it starts to put on its flowers and seeds, it can get infected with the fungus called Claviceps paspalum. And then this fungus can cause the honeydew to start, or it can cause the actual seed head can be replaced by a fungus, and the fungus products there, and can turn kind of white to kind of orange colored. And that's the endophyte, this fungal endophyte there. And when the cattle consume that, they can take in this toxin, this mycotoxin called Paspalum, which can cause some neurological issues, what's often referred to as Dallisgrass staggers. It can cause twitching of muscles, and again, it can cause cattle to sometimes fall or get stuck in a muddy pond area, possibly drown or something like that. It can be stressful for them moving them. One thing you can do is monitor your Dallisgrass pastures and shred the seeds off of them in the summer if you start to see something like that, because that is where that mycotoxin is concentrated. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Control options. Being a grass, there's not a whole lot of options there. One of the options that's available to producers in a Bermuda grass pasture is in the fall or winter, when you get that first frost on the Bermuda grass is typically going to start to go dormant. And when the Bermuda grass goes dormant, you can try glyphosate at 16 ounces per acre broadcast. Now, you could possibly damage the Bermuda grass a little bit if it's not fully dormant, but that is about the only chemical control option that we have right now for Dallisgrass. You can also do some spot treatments with glyphosate. Go ahead, Casey. And the last thing I want to talk about is not one particular plant by itself, but yet kind of a family. These are sedges. All of these plants, even though they don't look a lot like each other, are sedges. The bigger picture to the left is called Cherokee sedge. That's one I get brought into my office quite a bit. It is a sedge. It's not a grass, but it's a grass-like plant. It has a male flower, which is at the top, and the female flowers are kind of out at the bottom that look a little bit more like a cone there in the picture. The upper right picture is purple nut sedge, and it creates these little nutlets that are growing underground connected to the mother plant. And if those nutlets, there can be several hundred nutlets underneath the plant. And if you pull up the parent plant, if you've ever gardened, then you'll release those nutlets and you'll have hundreds of daughter plants popping up. The one on the right at the bottom is called cylindric sedge, which looks a lot like one called globe sedge, which has very similar seed balls on the top, but they're more on the cylindric. They're longer and more cylindrical in shape than the globe sedge is. So sedges can be annual, they can be perennial. Again, go ahead and go to the next slide. They're often found in wet areas. Typically, sedges have triangular stems. We say sedges have edges. That's one of the things we often think of. I'll tell you that people that like to plant things for turkeys will plant a plant sometimes called chufa, which is yellow nut sedge. Turkeys like yellow nut sedge. Hogs, if you have issues with hogs, they will dig up areas that have sedge in them. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Sedges are grass-like. So in Texas, there's like 1,400 species of grass. There's about 500 species of sedge, and there's about 500 species of another plant called rushes, or another family of plants called rushes. And they all get confusing sometimes. Typically, a grass is going to have a hollow stem, main stem, that's usually round or kind of flattened. And where the leaves come off at the nodes, it's going to be swollen or kind of a knot there. And the leaves typically come off the stem in opposite pairs. Sedges, you're going to have a solid stem that's kind of full of pith that's usually triangular in shape. And then the leaves are usually going to come off the stem in 3 different sides. And then rushes, which can be thrown in there and confusing, the stems are typically round and solid, kind of full of pith. And the leaves are typically just at the base of the plant. Okay, go to the last slide there. And as far as control options, Outrider, which is sulfosulfuron, or Permit, which is halosulfuron at 1 1/3 ounce per acre, plus non-ionic surfactant are kind of your options there to try for sedges. Permit is safe for all types of grasses. Outrider is only labeled for Bermuda grass. And much like we talked about in the Johnsongrass control, if you're going to spray a field for sedges, you don't want to mow or graze for 2 weeks before or after the treatment. And glyphosate spot treatments are something else you can do. Okay, Casey, that's my last slide. And again, folks, I know this is a little bit different. We've got a chat box. If anybody's got some questions, put them in the chat. And I'm going to turn it over to Jason Banta next so that we can kind of stay on track. Dr. Banta is an associate professor and extension beef cattle specialist stationed at our AgriLife Research and Extension Center in Overton. And he's got some great information today on the importance of a set calving season and value-added marketing. And so, Jason, I'm going to turn it